How are you guys doing? Welcome back to the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, Manny Maradiaga, live today on April 15th with another round of NFL stories and topics that happened over the weekend and some breaking news that happened today, referencing the episode from Friday. To start off today's show, we're going to talk about DeVonta Smith's new contract extension with the Philadelphia Eagles that was announced today. Then later in the show, we're going to talk about Jared Goff's latest comments about his time in the Detroit Lions organization, how he's reflected on the trade and all the good that he's experienced, but also some of the negative that he has seen as well as the Detroit Lions quarterback. Then to wrap up the show later on, some comments Joe Burrow made, updating everyone on his wrist injury, talking about the taunting rule, and talking about the matchup with the Kansas City Chiefs, that rivalry that's sort of been brewing over the last few years. All of that on today's episode. Stick around. Make sure to follow, like, and subscribe to the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast. And before I start on the first segment, I want to remind you guys, as I always do, if you have any questions or comments during today's show, please use the tip and donations link, gsmcpodcast.net, that you see on your screen with any of your questions or comments. Using that link makes it able for me to see your question pop up in the chat box. I can read it on air, and we can carry on the conversation that way, maybe take it in a different direction. It's more engaging, more entertaining, I think, and it's a big help for the show. So again, if you're able to use that link, the tip and donations link with gsmcpodcast.net, it would be a big help for this show and all the shows across the network. We always thank you guys greatly whenever you guys are able to use that with your questions or comments. But that being said, like I mentioned, we sort of predicted something happening with DeVonta Smith. Well, not necessarily DeVonta Smith, but last week on Friday or Thursday, I mentioned the Antoine Winfield deal that was brewing, that was getting close, according to Adam Schefter. And I said that these sort of deals usually happen over the weekend, leading into the following week. So I wouldn't be surprised if we get this extension done this past weekend. I was sort of right. Kind of connects to this. DeVonta Smith extension happened today, this morning, the news broke. So I was kind of in the ballpark there a little bit, predicting it. I didn't mention DeVonta Smith, but I wasn't too far off because on Friday, specifically that day, I talked about the Eagles now targeting DeVonta Smith and trying to get an extension done with him. I didn't think it would happen this quickly, in all honesty. Just on Friday, I talked about it being close, and then today the news broke. He signs a new 3-year, $75 million deal with the Philadelphia Eagles, $51 million being guaranteed. It was also announced today that the Eagles will exercise his 5th-year option. So, DeVonta Smith is still on his rookie deal. This year will be his final year on his rookie contract, 2024. Then 2025, it will be the 5th-year option year. He will be guaranteed $15.6 million on that 5th-year option. And then in 2026 is when this new contract starts to count against the salary cap and in the Philadelphia Eagles books. A great deal. It's, now that I'm saying it out loud, it's pretty outstanding how they managed to do this and plan it out, because it just extends him with this new 3-year deal and the 5th-year option and everything like that. It keeps him another 4 years, 5 years, technically, if you count 2024, with this new deal and the 5th-year option. It keeps him with the Eagles until 2028, and that's huge. The Eagles, I mentioned, have a history, a good reputation of signing their star players, especially if they drafted them. Not necessarily that they don't do it with the players they sign as free agents or trade, but they usually really value their players that they scouted, got to know, groomed them since they were drafted into the star player like DeVonta Smith is. It really shows you how much they value those picks, how much they value those players. And it's always great for other players to see if they think about coming to the Eagles that they don't mess around with things like this. They want to make sure their players stay with them as long as possible. I'm sure it's a reason why Saquon, while talking with Howie Roseman and the Eagles, really liked it. I'm sure they gave him the number, and they seemed very serious about extension talks, contract negotiations, and that's always a great thing for organizations like the Eagles. And on that, I mentioned the longevity on DeVonta Smith's contract and how really well worked this was. DeVonta Smith is only 25 years old. I'm not sure if he just turned 25 or if he's going to turn 26, but thinking about down the road, this keeps him until around when he's 28, 29 years old. And that's amazing, like I mentioned, for a number of reasons. You keep him really on like a 5-year deal if you think about it, starting from now until 2028. He's only 25 years old, like I mentioned, drafted back in 2021 as the 10th overall pick, had great years, just finished his third year with the Eagles this last season, another very solid, pretty outstanding year for DeVonta Smith. 80 receptions, over 1,000 receiving yards, and 7 touchdowns. Had a great rookie year, broke a few of the Eagles' rookie receiving records in that year. Then they trade for A.J. Brown, make a run at the Super Bowl. This year is a bit more down, but still, DeVonta Smith is a consistent presence in their offense. Safe to say he's not the reason why they've been struggling. It's really mostly been on the defensive side of the ball. So they make sure they keep around this consistency for the foreseeable future. And the media asked DeVonta Smith about this back in February, with this extension eligibility coming into effect in this month, or it was in March. I'm not quite sure of it, but they asked him about it back in February. And his quote, he didn't seem too worried about it. He seemed pretty unbothered by it when he said, "Let the chips fall where they fall. When the time comes, it comes. I'm not necessarily focused on it." And it was good that he wasn't. This all worked out well. Quicker, I'm sure, than most people expected. Definitely more earlier than I expected with the Eagles and how they re-signed all of their players, really all their big-name players, just midway through April before the draft. Now they could focus on that next process of their draft players, trying to sign them to rookie deals, and so on and so on. They also get to focus on off-season workouts and everything like that, which I'm going to get into later in this show. But it's a great deal, again, for the Eagles. I can't stress that enough. And into the finer details of the deal, DeVonta Smith will earn $25 million per year. Like we sort of predicted, ballparked it before on Friday, what we could anticipate, what was being said around the league, what sort of contract the Eagles could agree with him, and it is $25 million per year, the same as A.J. Brown's deal, but he signed a 4-year, $100 million deal. DeVonta Smith's is 1 year less, same amount per year, which means that the Eagles now have 2 of the top 5 highest paid wide receivers in terms of average per year. The only receivers that make more than those 2, the Eagles receivers, are Tyreek Hill, who leads everybody at $30 million, Devontae Adams, second at $28 million per year, and then Cooper Kupp in third at $26.7 million per year. And that doesn't really matter right now when you look at it, but looking long term, this is one of the biggest points I wanted to make, was that with this deal, essentially being almost like a 5-year deal. It says 3 years, $75 million, but with the last year of the rookie deal, the 5th-year option, plus the 3 other years, you get him on a 5-year period for $25 million per year, which seems, like I mentioned, a lot because he is top 5 right now. But if you're looking down the line with the contract extensions of Justin Jefferson, CeeDee Lamb, you have Jamar Chase coming up pretty soon. Brandon Ayuk's going to want another one. Nico Collins is a sneaky one. He won't make top 5, top 8 money, but he's another contract extension that has to get done sooner rather than later. By getting Smith now on this 5-year period, it looks expensive right now, but looking down the line, 2 years, 3 years, this might look like a bargain in 2027, 2028, when you're looking at these outstanding numbers, potentially over $30 million, with guys like Justin Jefferson or CeeDee Lamb. How the Eagles work this in right now, it's very good business for them. It's very well worked. a genius move by them to sign it right now. And now they have DeVonta Smith, Jalen Hurts, Landon Dickerson, Jordan Mailata, and Jake Elliott, their kicker. We still show love to the kickers, all under contract until or through 2028. Saquon Barkley also just signed, so he's under contract, I want to say, until 2027 or 2028 also. I think it's 2027, but regardless, he also just signed a new deal with them. So he is another name on that list. And now, like I mentioned before, to wrap this all up, you get this out of the way. You get moving with other things you have to handle, like a new offensive coordinator coming in, Kellen Moore coming in from the Los Angeles Chargers to be their offensive coordinator, formerly of the Chargers, before that with the Dallas Cowboys. So there is some familiarity there between Moore and the Eagles, just seeing him twice every year. Now he's their offensive coordinator, and you don't have contract talks circling around everybody's heads, all these other players being asked about it. You get all that stuff out of the way. You can focus on football, and you can focus on trying to get this offense to look as high-powered as it did last year, and even more so in 2022. Now that you can only focus on football, and you've tied down some of your biggest stars on offense to move on even before the draft, which is huge. I mentioned it's great that they got it done before the other big-name wide receivers. And more than that, it's just the way that the Eagles do it, just execution, efficiency with them. It doesn't get lost with them or anybody in the organization. And now it really just puts, I don't want to say pressure, but all the attention now is just solely on football. They began their offseason program today, so getting everybody back in the building, starting to talk football, starting to see how all these pieces fit together. It's going to go a lot smoother, and it's going to seem a lot clearer now that everybody is there to stay until 2028, 2027 with some of their best players, and it's a great way to do it. And now we'll see how this offense goes, how it matures, how it develops over the next few months. Football's a long way away, but it all starts now, trying to get integrated with everybody. It's a good thing for the Eagles, and kudos to them for getting it done. We'll see how it all materializes down the line, and heading into the draft, they have a big pick coming up, so we'll keep our eyes on that as well. But in saying that, we'll leave that topic there, but there's a lot more to come on today's episode of the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast. After the break, I'm going to get into that same topic. The rest of the NFL starting their spring workout programs here today. I'm going to get into 3 teams that I wanted to zone in on and talk about heading into the rest of this offseason, looking into the draft, and what they need to address after the draft or during the draft to potentially have more success in 2024. So stick around for that. More stories coming up on today's episode of the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on their face shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that clown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my sound. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift. Oh, I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Moving right along with today's episode of the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast with our second segment. 25 other teams, the rest of the league, starts their spring workout programs today. In the weeks prior, these 2 weeks before, The earliest teams to start were back on April 2nd. Then you had the following week with the next group of players or next group of teams starting. Now you have the rest of the NFL starting their offseason programs. I mentioned those teams before that got that head start. Usually all the teams with the new head coaches, because they have new head coaches. Obviously, you need to bring in whole new programs, schemes, rules, itineraries, all that little stuff that had to get ironed out. They are provided those 2 extra weeks to get everything situated. Those teams were the Falcons, the Chargers, the Seahawks, the Commanders, the Panthers, the Titans, and the New England Patriots were already underway with their programs. Now you have the rest of the 25 teams all starting today. And I wanted to focus in on the 3 teams that I thought were the most interesting, but also that weren't really talked about too much in the offseason. Not too many headlines around them, not too many star signings. So I wanted to zone in on them and talk about them today and break down some of the things that they have to figure out heading into the draft, what they could potentially target, and stuff like that. Starting off with the first team on my list is the New Orleans Saints. Not too many big signings in the offseason, like I mentioned. They released Michael Thomas, and other than that, there hasn't been too much. They brought in Chase Young on a 1-year deal, so those 2 were really the biggest developments this offseason for them. They have the 14th pick in the first round. This is Dennis Allen's 3rd year as the head coach of the Saints. They're coming off a 9-8 season. So again, some good, some bad. You had some good from Chris Olave. Derek Carr had his moments, some really good ones, some very bad ones. And Alvin Kamara showed probably to be the most consistent player after coming back from his suspension. So there is some good and bad, but the biggest storyline with the Saints in the offseason is the health, the update status of their outside tackle, Ryan Ramczyk. He has a knee injury, had surgery on it. Before the surgery, it caused him to miss a lot. He was in and out of the 2023 season, in and out of their lineup, so he decided to get surgery on it. Not considered a big deal at the time. It wasn't anything big like torn ACL or anything like that. It was just bothering him. It didn't look to be a big deal at the moment. But then in December, Ramczyk told reporters that the cartilage in his knee had actually deteriorated. Those were his words. So he decided to get that surgery, putting an end to his season in December. And that was all done. It all looked to be, all right, he's getting the surgery. We'll see you back here next year, and it'll all be great. But in late March, Dennis Allen spoke to some media members, and he said that he expected Ryan Ramczyk to be further along in his process of his recovery. And a lot of sources close to the team, close to Ramczyk, have said that it's taking longer than expected. And because of this slight worry, the New Orleans Saints renegotiated his contract that he signed that month on March 12th this year. They renegotiated that and restructured it, and now his base salary is a lot less, but his signing bonus was increased to iron out the balance book, the checkbooks for the New Orleans Saints. So they had to realign that because of this worry that is becoming a bit more serious, because he is one of the more solid players on their offensive line, and already their offensive line was not the best, and to have him in an uncertain status right now. He is of an older age. I think he's in his 7th, 8th season now in the NFL. To have knee problems, to not quite honestly be too sure on what the status is, what he'll look like, is worrying. So that now becomes the focus of this Saints team. And picking it 14th in the draft is great, but they only have 2 picks in the first 2 days of the draft. So that's the first 3 rounds, and they only have 2 picks to iron out a lot more holes that this team really needs to figure out. Other than offensive line, they need probably another pass rusher. They brought in Chase Young, but how is he going to look health-wise as well? On top of performance, how ready he is to start, be one of the best pass rushers, hopefully, on the Saints. They also need wide receiver. Other than Chris Olave, no other receiver showed a lot of consistency, reliability with Derek Carr to be one of their main options, again, other than Chris Olave. And that offensive line, I mentioned how shaky it is because last year they traded up for Trevor Penning in the first round, but it didn't work out at all for them. He was actually benched at one point during the season last year, and Andreas Pete, who replaced him, is still a free agent, and they weren't able to re-sign him. So a lot of players, or a lot of offensive linemen specifically missing from their offensive line. They have to figure that out on top of trying to get better in other positions. Those are really the biggest things. Seeing what Ryan Ramczyk is looking like, and then getting a pick 14, maybe an idea to try and trade back and accumulate more picks is an idea, but you also want the best players to try and compete as best as you can. Because Dennis Allen, quite honestly, if it goes worse than 9-8, could be looking to be on the hot seat. So a lot of factors to account for with the Saints. Not the best because, again, salary cap and all their issues they've had with that. They're in a tough spot, so I'm interested to see how they develop and try to get out of the situation. Probably trading back is the best option for me. But that's that with the Saints. Right behind them at the 15th pick in the draft is the Indianapolis Colts. Again, another 9-8 team. 15th pick in the NFL draft, 9-8 team, like I mentioned. This is the second year for their new head coach last year, Shane Steichen, with the team and trying to figure everything out. And unlike the Saints, who seem to hit a plateau and kind of be trending downward, the Colts, also 9-8, are almost on the upward trend because there are some good signs that they were able to do. Bring back Michael Pittman, re-sign Julian Blackmon, even though it's a one-year deal. He's back with the team. Kenny Moore re-signed with them. But then other than that, they haven't signed too many other players to make themselves better. These moves are great, probably really big for them because of you don't want to get worse. If you don't get better, you definitely don't want to get worse. So they brought back their biggest players. And similarly with the Saints, a health question is their biggest concern. Around the health of their young quarterback, Anthony Richardson, had shoulder surgery that ended his season last year, but he had some very impressive games throughout that. I want to say it was against the Rams and against the Jaguars. Both losses, but he played very well in them, rushed for a couple touchdowns, threw a couple in another game, had a good amount of yards as well. And that just comes with a young team. You're not going to probably win these close games because of lack of experience, but he showed very good amount of promise in those games. Unfortunately, he had to deal with those injuries, concussions on top of the shoulder. So that's really the biggest concern with them. Trying to see where he is now that these programs are starting. Having him in the building, checking up on him more closely will be something to monitor. As well as in the draft, they don't need too much other than defensive back and wide receiver as their more glaring needs. They'll have all 7 of their draft picks in the draft to address these two before anything. So that's the biggest thing. Defensive back is looking like the more likely, just what's coming out of sources, draft analysts reporting on the draft, because this is one of the youngest secondaries in the NFL. In their final 4 games, final 4 weeks of the NFL season, they ranked 30th in quarterback completion percentage. Opposing quarterbacks were completing nearly 70% of their passes against the Colts. Great players, Julian Blackmon, Kenny Moore, but they need just a bit more experience, which is why I mentioned Justin Simmons as a great option for them to add in the offseason. I mean, they still could do it. He's still a free agent, but it's that price tag they have to figure out. But if they can figure that out, I think he would add great experience to this secondary, a leader back there, a quarterback to get everybody in position. I think he would be a great addition because of that stat and just because I think it's a natural fit for him there, leading this young team. And on top of that, I mentioned still defensive back remains a priority for them. Terrion Arnold, Quinyon Mitchell are the top 2 projected corners in this draft. And luckily for the Colts and anybody ranging from that 12 to 17 range at the latest, I think, will probably get one of these 2 top corners. And it's great because it is in line with what they need. Terrion Arnold or Quinyon Mitchell, it just comes down to preference with the Colts and whoever they decide to draft there. It's been said that they are intrigued a lot by Brock Bowers. That's a sneaky sort of storyline that's going around. Everybody thinking that the Colts are really attracted to Brock Bowers as a prospect. A lot of people have said to keep an eye on it. If he starts falling in the draft to 11, 12, look for the Colts to maybe entertain a trade. Their general manager, Chris Ballard, hasn't really done that as the general manager of the Colts, but that is something to keep an eye on. But if that doesn't happen and Brock Bowers is taken 9 or 10, the Colts will most likely go with corner, and it's good for them. And then you look at wide receiver. This draft class is extremely deep at that position, so they have an early or mid-second round pick that I'm sure they're going to address it there. So the Colts, similar to the Saints, but trending in a lot more positive. It's looking a lot more promising for them to grow this next season. And then to wrap it up, I have the Miami Dolphins picking a few picks later, the 21st pick in the NFL draft. 11-6 last year in the third year, or this is going to be the third year for Mike McDaniels. They were 11-6, like I mentioned, but they lost that division title to the Buffalo Bills in a crushing sort of way the last few games where they lost to them. And it was unfortunate the way that they lost it, but they did show great signs throughout the season. You can't just let one game, 2 games, as bad as they were, determine how you feel about the whole season. Overall, I think the Dolphins can feel very positive about it. The way Tyreek Hill played, obviously had an amazing year. Jalen Waddle, Tua looking a bit better, a bit calmer, a bit more in control throughout the season. Got them to the playoffs. It didn't end how they wanted, but they still have great players on there. Raheem Mostert, again, broke out this season. It's surprising to say because he is like 31 years old, considered very old for a running back, the way the market values him nowadays, but he disproved that, had an amazing season for them, and just the rest of their team looked great, and in the offseason, they got even better by adding players like Shaq Barrett, Kendall Fuller, Jordan Poyer, Anthony Walker, to replace a lot of the players that left them in free agency, a couple of offensive linemen, and a lot of players on that defense. But like I mentioned, they were able to bring in a lot of players that are able to replace them right away. So their biggest need still remains trying to replace probably their most important player in Christian Wilkins, who left, as well as their right guard, Robert Hunt, who also left in free agency to the Carolina Panthers. And they sit in a spot as well where 21, Byron Murphy is there projected to be the best defensive tackle in the draft. He is in that range where they could be hopeful that he falls to there. Not many teams, again, really need that. Maybe the Seahawks at 16. I've seen him be mocked there. The Jaguars at 17. The Rams, not to mention them, obviously with Aaron Donald moving on. That's probably the biggest threat, thinking of it now. But at 21, they could still find an offensive lineman. But again, it could be, to play devil's advocate, it could be a little bit early to start picking at that next group of top offensive linemen, because I think all the best ones are going to start going at 12, probably up until 15, 16 as well. So it might be a little bit too late for the Dolphins. And they just have to figure out how to use these picks because, again, similarly to the Saints, they only have 2 picks in the first 2 days as well, in the first round and second round. So they have to be very selective, not take too much of a gamble. Again, they could trade back, but if they keep those 2 picks, not be too open to gambling on them, reaching for a player that they think is going to be good. You have to be certain because they have limited picks. And if they hit on one of them, like really hit on one of them out of the 2, I think that's a pretty successful job to do with a limited amount of picks. With the roster that they have, they're still going to be competitive with how the Bills are looking, really only competing with the Jets at this point in the division. I think it's looking much better for the Dolphins because they were able to replenish with so many of these free agents. And a sneaky narrative to just follow is how Tua still continues to grow. Didn't finish the season like he wanted to, like I mentioned, but seeing that growth is what everybody wants to see, and that's going to be the biggest tell on the Dolphins. Yeah, they have a great roster, like I mentioned, but he really is the piece that needs to bring it all together. A lot of their offense is through timing and the connection that the receivers have with Tua. So that's going to be the biggest storyline to follow. Seeing Tua's development, he has to stay healthy, has to play better in cold weather cities in the playoffs when everywhere is cold. And if he does that, I'm really liking the Dolphins. They're probably my pick to win the division. I know a lot of people are high on the Jets and still even on the Bills, but for me, I think it's still all about the Dolphins if Tua can get it right. I have confidence in him, but we'll see how it all pans out for the Dolphins and those other two teams like I mentioned. In saying that, we'll leave that topic there and we'll move on with the show. We're going to go into the second break, and on the other side, we're going to talk about Jared Goff, what he said about his time with the Lions so far, and we're going to go in on Joe Burrow and what his status is with his wrist injury, as well as him touching on the rivalry that's been brewing with the Kansas City Chiefs. So both of those stories coming up in just a few seconds. Don't go anywhere. Both of them are up next.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
Back here on the show to continue on with our topics around what's being said around the league. We're going to get into Jared Goff and his comments last week, but as a last reminder, if you have any questions or comments on today's episode, make sure to use the tip and donations link, gsmcpodcast.net, that you see there on your screen or running across the ticker down below. If you use that link, I'm able to see your question pop up in the chat box right away. We can comment, take the conversation elsewhere during the live show on whatever segment you have a question or comment on. It's a lot more engaging, a lot more entertaining, a lot more like a conversation. I think it's a lot better that way. It's a big help for the show as well, this show as well as all the other shows. We thank you greatly every time you guys are able to do that. So again, the tip and donations link is gsmcpodcast.net if you guys are able to use that with any of your questions or comments. But again, moving into Jared Goff, and he reflected a little bit on his journey last week when he appeared on the Trading Cards podcast through the Detroit Press. He reflected a little bit on his time with the Detroit Lions, going back to 2021 with that trade of Matthew Stafford, sending Stafford to the Rams, Jared Goff coming the other way, as well as a couple of first-round picks. And looking back on it, most people will say right away it went great for the Rams, potentially that they won the trade because they accomplished what they wanted to do, win the Super Bowl with Matthew Stafford. And then after that, it's not to say that the Rams, have fallen off or anything like that. I've been really impressed with what they've done. But, they've been 10-7, kind of lingering around that playoff hunt a little bit, certainly being in it, but they weren't as dominant as they were right off the bat. They certainly could get there, but time is sort of not on their side with Matthew Stafford. But to say that, on the other hand, a lot of people didn't think too much of the Lions. The Lions were at a very low point in that time period when Jared Goff went over there. To say also Jared Goff also wasn't a highly regarded quarterback that went to the Lions and people instantly thought this was going to work out right away. He's there to save the organization. Both teams were in a very low point, and the Lions at that point also hadn't won or had a winning record in 3 years at that point. So it was almost like Jared Goff was at the time sent there with the idea that nothing is really going to happen there. We're just going to end up forgetting about them. And Jared Goff, on that idea of really not accepting defeat at that point, he said, being shipped off and being sent to a place to die, essentially, is what a lot of people think it was, and I was never going to allow that to happen. And he went on to praise his coaches, the players, the organization for the team's turnaround, and it really was through those picks, the emergence of Amon-Ra St. Brown, drafting Jahmyr Gibbs with one of those picks, signing David Montgomery as well, the job Dan Campbell has done, not to mention him as well being a big part of this. All of that just miraculously mixed together and formed this great team that now everybody is excited about heading into 2024 and coming off a year where they went 12-5. They were the number 3 seed, won the NFC North. They made the NFC Championship game where nobody really thought it was going to be them. They, meaning Jared Goff, the whole team, earned Detroit their first playoff win in 32 years. And just on top of that, individually, he had a great year, over 4,500 yards, 30 touchdowns, and a career-high 67% completion percentage on the year. He's 29 years old, if I remember correctly. So this has really turned into something that not a lot of people would have predicted. And Jared Goff has not lost sight of that. He's very grateful for it when he said, again, in that interview, in hindsight, being traded to Detroit was one of the greatest things that ever happened to me for my career and my development as a human because of everything that happened there, like I mentioned. Really a miraculous story, Cinderella-ish story, but they really just went about it the right way. Like I mentioned, all those players emerging. To me, it's really all about that offensive line for them that's kept them relevant and has really been the catalyst for everything that has gone well for them in games where you might think the 49ers might have more firepower or the Eagles might have more firepower than them. It's the offensive lines that really control the game, put an identity on the game, set the tone for the Lions. Their offensive line's probably top 2, if not the best offensive line in all of football. And you see that in games where they go in as the underdog. They were bullying the heck out of the 49ers in that first half of the NFC Championship game. It really was their game to lose, and that inexperience cost them in the end. I'm sure Jared Goff and the Lions still have a bad taste in their mouth from that, but it shouldn't take away from the season, the whole journey that Jared Goff and the Lions have had up until now. But in saying that, I've mentioned a lot of positives, Cinderella, underdog, overcoming a lot of things, but one negative that Jared Goff wanted to pick on, just touch on a little bit with this interview, was with the local media, the Detroit Media News, that interviews him obviously a lot after games. He added that he was sort of confused with the local media's view on the team and how some stories are portrayed more negative than positive. In the season that they had last year, he didn't understand why a lot of the stories were spun in a way that made it seem a bit negative going forward. Specifically, he said on that topic, I have this thing with our local media where they almost like relish in the negativity at times, and maybe that's what gets clicks and that's what sells, but it's no longer what they need to live in. Then he went on and mentioned the portrayal of them always being the underdog, it seems, with the local media. Then he said that it's not like that. Like, hey, this team is good now. We don't have to always think that we're at a disadvantage, was really the essence of the whole point he wanted to make. And it is fair to say that for Jared Goff, he has the utmost confidence in his team. I certainly do. I'm a believer in the Lions and Dan Campbell especially. But you look at the media and everybody, all the fans especially, who have had to live through the tough times of the Detroit Lions, the media that has followed them so closely and has seen them through some of the toughest of times, brings up this pessimistic view because, one, they're not used to it. They're not used to the Lions or believing in the Lions that they're just going to continue this role of being dominant. Usually it happens where the Lions are decent and then it might fall off a little bit and it might not continue to happen. So that's one thing. But everybody in the NFC or this local media might see the Packers getting better through free agency, the Eagles bringing in Saquon, Atlanta bringing in a new quarterback, Chicago bringing in Keenan Allen, probably drafting Caleb Williams, and getting better. The 49ers still have a stacked roster. Everybody sees these teams getting better, and just based on the history that the Detroit Lions have, you can see why there is a pessimistic view there of looking around thinking, wow, these teams are actually getting better. What are the Lions doing? They haven't really gotten too much better. They actually lost one of their better receivers, Josh Reynolds, to the Denver Broncos. So they have to address some of those things in the draft, maybe add another safety after they lost C.J. Gardner-Johnson. So a lack of movement can be a cause to pause and be a little bit worried, I guess, for some of this local media as to why they always view them this way. Overly cautious is another way to say it, but again, I just go back to the offensive line because it is so dominant, because it really was the determinant in a lot of these games where the Lions just ran away with, just really closed out with this offensive line and running the ball. I think that just keeps them at the top with all these teams, regardless if they have a great receiver in Amon-Ra St. Brown. Jared Goff is great. They have great young players. Aiden Hutchinson is great. Brian Branch is awesome. Jack Campbell, their linebacker that they drafted, again, another underrated piece to them. So they have great players, but it's really that offensive line that is that counter to all the star power that all these other teams add. It keeps them in games, and I'm a big fan of it. Not to mention that it plays off of their great running game. We saw last year how David Montgomery and Jahmyr Gibbs played off of each other. That tag teaming with their offensive line, it's probably one of the best combinations in all of football to have two of these great running backs. Such different styles that could surprise defenses. David Montgomery punishing on short yard situations, goal line situations where you know it's coming but you can't stop it with David Montgomery. And then you have Jahmyr Gibbs, who had a great rookie season, changing the pace a lot faster, very quick in tackling situations, only going to improve going forward in his second year. Now knowing what an NFL season is like, he's only going to get better and add a lot more, another dynamic feature to this Lions offense. I'm very high on them. I definitely think they need to add a little bit more because in some of the biggest games it will cost you. But I don't think they should be looked at an underdog as much as the local media might see them. I do agree with Jared Goff mostly, but I can see why the media, as a fan of a team that has been stuck in a plateau in the Steelers, I can see why there is a pessimism there to see some things go well, but not truly believing it until you see it. A lot of fans feel that way. It's a common theme that you see with a lot of fans in sports. These franchises, great histories, trying to get back to the glory days. It is a common theme, a pessimistic view, but again, I think the Lions are one organization, one trend to hop on going forward. They have a good core of players, great coach. They have everything they need. They just need that experience and filling out that roster. I'm sure they're going to be able to do it in these next few months before the season officially starts there back in September. But that's the Lions. That's where Jared Goff views them at this moment. We're going to go to the last break of the show, and on the other side of it, we're going to come back and talk about another quarterback in the AFC, Joe Burrow, giving us updates on how he's doing, talking about the rivalry with the Kansas City Chiefs, all of that coming up in just a few seconds. Don't go anywhere. That last story is up next.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Welcome back to the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast. For this last segment, Joe Burrow. What has Joe Burrow been up to in all these months that we really haven't seen him, heard too much from him? What's he been up to? How's his status going on his health? How much can he improve this Cincinnati Bengals team that finished 9-8-ish? Weren't great, weren't awful, but you expect a lot more from this Bengals team. And Joe Burrow obviously makes the world of difference for this team. And to give an update, he was actually a live guest on the live episode of the New Heights podcast last week with the Kelsey brothers, where they had a live episode at their alma mater, the University of Cincinnati. They got all their diplomas, they did all the great things, had a great show, and they had Joe Burrow on from Ohio, from Cincinnati, and they had him on as a live guest, and they interviewed him, asked him a few things, and one of the things that they covered with Burrow, funny enough, to start off, was the taunting penalty and the tweet that he put out there during the Ravens game and the Chiefs game. When, if you remember, Zay Flowers had a taunting penalty. I want to say it was Zay Flowers. I'm almost 90% sure it was Zay Flowers, but had a taunting penalty that really hurt their drive, that looked like they were on the way to either take the lead or tie the game. And during that, Burrow responded on Twitter with a simple statement saying, "Let the guys taunt." It was funny. He talked about it more lightheartedly. He said, "Yes, I'm pro taunting. We're all grown adults that work really hard at what we do, and sometimes we'd like to show it. I'm not going to get my feelings hurt if somebody sacks me and taunts me. Like, you made a play, I get it, like, good for you." It's funny, he kept it lighthearted to open up his whole statement and reflect on that more. If you just recall, the NFL have been trying to emphasize it more, starting from 2021. But then since then, it's sort of dropped a little bit from that point. Went from 43 flags tossed on for taunting in 2021, all the way down to 19 in 2022. And then just last season, they only had 15 penalties for taunting. It was made as a sort of more of a joke on the lighthearted side, but it is something that will affect games. And they asked him about it because he seemed pretty serious about it. And he answered it in all honesty. I'm sure a lot of people will agree with Joe Burrow on that. But more seriously, the biggest thing that got headlines was what he said about the Kansas City Chiefs in that rivalry that sort of started heating up over the last few years, mostly in 2021, 2022, with the Bengals really just emerging as this team with Joe Burrow. They asked him about it and how he views the Bengals now stack up against the Chiefs going into this year. He said, "I think we match up pretty well with them. We're kind of built to beat them." That was the big headline that caught everyone's eye. We're built to beat the Kansas City Chiefs. It goes back to that instances on the field when it got a bit chippy between the two teams, specifically with Jamar Chase and some other players that got into each other's faces, had to be separated a few times. And afterwards, it goes back to Jamar Chase saying, I forget what year, if it was 2022 or 21, but if you remember, Jamar Chase had that clip when he was asked about who the best player in the NFL was, and he confidently, no doubt in his voice or anything, said Joe Burrow was the best player in the NFL in front of a media circle, media scrum after a game. It was funny because he said Joe Burrow, and then another reporter asked him, "What about Pat? What about Pat Mahomes?" And they said, "What about Pat?" And he said, very seriously, he said, "Pat who?" And everybody laughed. It was a pretty good joke, in all honesty. I thought it was great that he said Pat who, acting like he didn't know. Supporting his quarterback, you expect him to do that sort of thing. But afterwards, you say something like that, everyone's going to see it. Nobody responded on the Chiefs. Patrick Mahomes didn't respond in that moment. But then they go on to win the Super Bowl. Patrick Mahomes wins his second. And on Instagram, he responds so many months after with a picture of himself with his 2 Super Bowl rings saying, "That's who." Simple as that. That was the caption on the post. That's who, with the 2 Super Bowls. Everybody knew it, alluded back to that. But on that rivalry, Joe Burrow saying that the Bengals are built to beat the Chiefs. It almost seemed like that back in the days, in those years, like I mentioned, 2021, 2022, where the Bengals were the only team in the AFC to have beaten Mahomes in the playoffs since 2019. And Cincinnati beat them in that overtime win in Kansas City in the AFC Championship game where they made the Super Bowl, lost to the Rams, but they beat Patrick Mahomes on the road, not to mention. That was a big win. Then I'm pretty sure they beat them right after in the season afterwards. It looked like the Bengals had their number until the Kansas City Chiefs finally beat them the following year, 23-20, to go on and win their second Super Bowl. Then from that moment till now, Cincinnati missed the playoffs last season because of that season-ending injury that Joe Burrow sustained on his wrist. And we haven't seen too much of the playoff atmosphere sort of games with Joe Burrow and going in there and trying to win and take this team to the playoffs, back to the AFC Championship game. He needed season-ending surgery, like I mentioned, on the torn ligaments in his knee. So that was a big problem because, like I mentioned, this Cincinnati team is so much better with Joe Burrow, regardless of how their defense might have finished. I know that they ranked towards the bottom in yards allowed, points allowed per game last year, but that also had to do with Joe Burrow not being out there, shorter drives and things like that. When Joe Burrow's out there, when he plays at least 16 regular season games, Cincinnati has won double-digit games and has reached the AFC Championship game at least, at the minimum, with Joe Burrow there. So that in and of itself tells you all you need to know of how much Joe Burrow affects this team. He's up on that level, in all honesty, with Patrick, with Lamar, with C.J. Stroud. I'm throwing his name in there officially. I don't care what anybody says. From what I saw, I think he's up there. Josh Allen as well. Those guys that, regardless of who's on their team, how bad some people might think of it, it doesn't matter because they're the quarterback. I think Lamar Jackson has proven that. Patrick certainly proved it. If anybody had any doubts about him being one of the best, if not the best, quarterback in the league with a very poor wide receiver room last year, just goes on and wins the Super Bowl. Simple as that. Now Josh Allen is the one that kind of has to prove it now with Stephon Diggs not being there. How does he respond? Can he get his team in the playoffs, potentially win the division with a worse off roster than he's ever had? That's going to be the conversation this whole season around Josh Allen, so he's going to have to do that. And Burrow has certainly proven it, like I mentioned, with the defense that might not be all world. When he's in there, he just makes a difference. They always have the advantage, it seems, when he's in there. I've seen it a lot just from seeing the Steelers play the Bengals. He is a very good quarterback, probably top 3, I would say, in my estimation. But the biggest thing with him now is figuring out his wrist injury because he has that big of an impact. He gave an update on the team's website when they asked him about it. He said, "I've been able to pretty much do everything I normally do from lifting and a conditioning standpoint. I'm in a great spot body-wise." So that's always great to hear with the offseason programs now starting. It is only limited to non-football exercises and workouts. So we're going to see heading into OTAs and minicamp. If he takes part in that, it's a great sign for them. He had also that calf injury that was a scare a year or two ago that kind of affected everything with the Bengals. But if he goes in healthy, if he's 100%, they're going to have to address defense at some point. Linebacker, secondary specifically, after Awuzie went to the Tennessee Titans. If they address those spots, maybe another wide receiver, offensive line piece, this team is going to be right in the mix, and it's almost going to be like Joe Burrow never left. I think it's going to be seamless when he's in there with this Bengals team. And then potentially, hopefully, I'm sure, actually, we're going to see a matchup between the Bengals and the Chiefs at some point in the playoffs. I know it's going to happen if Burrow's 100% healthy. So that's something we have to look forward to. And that's pretty much everything Joe Burrow gave an update on. Talking about the Chiefs rivalry, his wrist injury seems to be going great, so that's always good. But the Bengals still have to figure out how to help him, because it's not as simple as I make it seem with Joe Burrow. Yes, he's great. Yes, he makes a difference for them. Yes, they always have a chance when he's in there. But you don't want a situation where during his rookie year, he got hit a ton. He was under pressure a lot during his rookie year, and he ended up having a very bad knee injury, and it ruled him out for the rest of the year. You don't want to see that anymore, which is why they signed Trent Brown to cover that other offensive tackle position. That's great. You still need, in my opinion, some more offensive line help. Tyler Boyd is probably not going to be there, so you might need another weapon. They brought in Mike Gesicki, but again, I think you still need another slot, third receiver kind of guy to really round out that offense. Defense as well. Secondary, it's looking very young and inexperienced right now with some of the players that they have. So there's still some great players out there as free agents, or they could end up drafting a corner or somebody that they like at the 18th overall pick. That all has to be ironed out, but as long as Joe Burrow's in there, as long as he keeps it as positive as he seems to be right now, the Bengals will be in the mix for sure in the AFC, a very loaded AFC that's going to be as entertaining as always, I believe, this upcoming season. So we'll see where the Bengals finish out. We'll see where Joe Burrow is at the end of this season. But what we won't have to see is any more segments on today's episode. That will do it for today's show of the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast. I want to thank you guys for tuning in to today's episode. And please remember to like, follow, and subscribe to the show, as well as following the network on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok for more of the content on top of sports, outside of sports as well. If you want to see more of me and this show, check out the GSMC Sports Network channel on YouTube and the podcast network on YouTube as well, where YouTube shorts are posted every day on other topics around the NFL. These live recorded shows, the full version of those, are all on both channels as well as individual segment videos. If you missed a certain segment or want to rewatch one part of the whole live show, they're all on there as well. Make sure to tune in every weekday at 6:30 p.m. Eastern Time for more NFL and football conversations. We're only a few days away from the NFL draft, so make sure to tune in for that. More coverage on that with me, Manny Maradiaga, as your host. Thanking you guys again for tuning in, and I'll see you guys all back here tomorrow.
Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit, and the coffee ain't hit yet, damn ain't